There are moments that slice a life in half, the instant before and the instant after. For Nathaniel Voss, that moment began with a signature. He didn't know it yet, but what he was about to do would shatter the neat geometry of his world, strip every layer of certainty, and drag him into a love he had spent years believing he could never deserve. The pen was heavy in his hand. The contract spread open on the mahogany desk, the city lights trembling on the glass like tiny witnesses. All he had to do was sign, and a woman he'd never met would carry his child. A poor stranger who would unknowingly become the axis of his redemption. He thought it was control. It was destiny, disguised as paperwork. Across town, in a narrow apartment that smelled of boiled rice and detergent, Clara Morales stared at the same contract through tears she didn't want to admit were hope. Her mother slept in the next room, breathing through a worn oxygen mask. The bills piled like walls around her. When the clinic called, she didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said, her voice steady though her hands trembled. And somewhere, miles away, Nathaniel heard that word through the phone. Soft, almost fragile. And for a reason he couldn't name, it stayed in his chest long after the line went silent. Neither of them knew that this single choice, born of desperation and pride, would soon unearth something larger than grief, larger than money, something that would make and unmake them both. Nathaniel had always believed that loss could be negotiated, the same way he negotiated power, through precision, contracts, and control. He was 42, tall and immaculate in the way men become when loneliness is their last remaining order. The world called him a miracle of strategy, a self-made titan who had multiplied his fortune tenfold after his wife's sudden death. But the truth was quieter and far less impressive. His empire had been built not on vision, but on avoidance. An attempt to fill every silence with the sound of movement, to buy enough companies and buildings so he would never again hear the echo of her voice in the empty house. He had buried her 3 years earlier, beneath a white stone inscribed with a single word she had loved: endure. Yet even as the world admired his composure, the word mocked him. He endured everything, except the child they never had. No treatment, no clinic, no whispered promise of science had restored what the doctors had declared impossible. The tests had confirmed it. The man who owned everything could create nothing. So he sought the kind of solution that money could purchase, but decency could not explain. His lawyer had spoken of surrogacy as if it were a legal equation: risk, consent, compensation. Nothing sentimental, nothing binding beyond the terms. Still, when he read the profiles of potential surrogates, he found himself stopping at one. A woman whose picture had no makeup, whose smile looked unposed. Clara Morales, 28 years old, factory worker, no spouse, one dependent, healthy, modest, anonymous. The file was thinner than most, yet it stayed in his hand long after he should have moved on. There was something in her eyes, something unspoken, as though she had already survived the thing he was still running from. He didn't believe in intuition, but he selected her name anyway. When his assistant asked if he wanted to interview her personally, he shook his head. "Just make it happen," he said, unaware that the moment he said it, something in the world began to rearrange. Clara had been waiting her whole life for something to change, though she never imagined it would arrive in the form of a contract with embossed letters and signatures she couldn't pronounce. Her world was small, a single bedroom shared with her sick mother, the hum of a second-hand refrigerator, the metallic taste of factory dust on her tongue. She worked 12-hour shifts folding linen for hotels she would never enter, and on most nights, she fell asleep counting how many more weeks the electricity would last before the next cut. When the clinic called her name, she thought it was a mistake. She had applied months ago, half believing no one would ever pick her. Women like her didn't get chosen. They got overlooked. But the nurse smiled softly. "The intended father has approved you," she said, sliding the papers across the counter. The words felt strange. Intended father. Like something sacred and artificial at once. Clara signed where she was told, her hands steady, her heart burning with a mixture of fear and strange dignity. When Nathaniel first saw her in person, it was supposed to be routine. a 5-minute meeting in the clinic's lounge to formalize consent. Yet as she entered, clutching a worn leather purse, something broke in the air. She was not what he expected. No trace of calculation in her eyes, no hunger for wealth, only the calm of someone who had learned to survive the long way. Her voice was soft, her posture nervous, but her gaze never lowered. "Mr. Voss," she said, and he heard respect without flattery. For a moment he forgot the purpose of the meeting. The doctor's voice droned through the protocol, terms, rights, future anonymity, and the signatures multiplied. When it ended, Clara thanked him, not for the money, but for trusting her body to carry something good. The phrase unsettled him. He almost corrected her. "It isn't trust, it's procedure," but the words never came. Instead he nodded and left, haunted by the absurd gentleness of what she'd said. Back in her apartment, Clara placed the first payment envelope in a tin box beneath her mother's bed. The old woman stirred, half awake, and asked if she'd found another job. "Something like that," Clara whispered, brushing a strand of silver hair from her forehead. Her mother didn't press further. She only murmured, "Don't let them take your soul, Mija." Clara smiled faintly. She didn't plan to. She told herself this was just work. 1 year, 1 child, a clean slate afterward. But as the days passed and the treatments began, the thought of the unseen man who had chosen her became oddly persistent. She imagined his face, his voice, the reason behind his need. She tried not to care. Caring made things harder to give back. Nathaniel kept the file on his desk, though there was no logical reason to do so. The arrangement required no contact after the initial approvals, yet he found himself rereading her medical reports late at night. It wasn't attraction, not in the conventional sense. It was curiosity tinged with envy, the kind that surfaces when someone else carries what you've been denied. Sometimes he'd picture her walking through the gray corridors of the clinic, the fluorescent lights falling over her shoulders like quiet blessings. He wondered if she felt fear, or if she had already accepted whatever price the universe asked of her. And though he had spent years mastering silence, Nathaniel began to notice that the emptiness of his home sounded different now. It wasn't just grief anymore. It was anticipation. Weeks later, the procedure was completed. A fertilized embryo, created from a donor's cell line chosen to resemble his late wife's traits, was implanted in Clara's womb. The doctor spoke with rehearsed optimism, promising high chances of success. Nathaniel stood behind the glass panel, expression unreadable, but his hands clenched so tightly that his knuckles whitened. When Clara opened her eyes after the anesthesia, she saw his reflection on the other side, distant, almost spectral. Their gazes met for a heartbeat, and something unspoken passed between them. She didn't know that he was seeing, in her exhaustion, the same quiet strength that had once lived in his wife's eyes. He didn't know that she was looking at him and seeing every man who had ever believed he could buy peace. From that day forward, their lives began to orbit each other in ways neither understood. His assistant reported her progress weekly. He pretended not to care, but he read every line twice. Her health reports became his new stock market. Her heartbeat a private investment no one else knew existed. Clara, meanwhile, kept her secret world turning. Work, care, injections, nausea. Yet sometimes she'd wake at night with a strange sense that someone, somewhere, was awake at the same hour, thinking of the same fragile pulse within her. It wasn't romance, it was recognition. The silent acknowledgement between two people carrying different weights of the same longing. And though they lived on opposite ends of the city, the space between them was already shrinking, drawn together by the quiet gravity of what they had set in motion. The first months passed in silence, a rhythm of appointments and numbers. Nathaniel tracked Clara's medical reports like a man watching his own reflection change from afar. The clinic sent sterile updates, hormone levels, weight, vitals. But he read them as if they were scripture, decoding meaning in every fluctuation, every deviation from normal. For the first time in years, he had something to wait for that wasn't profit. Still, he refused to admit it, even to himself. The world saw only a disciplined tycoon, untouched by sentiment, while inside, something restless began to stir. At night, when the city dimmed beneath the ocean-colored glass of his penthouse, He'd stand by the window with a glass of water he never drank, feeling time crawl against the glass like rain. It was then he noticed how the silence had changed. It wasn't empty anymore. It hummed. It was as if the unborn life growing miles away was reshaping the air around him. But control, his oldest instinct, refused surrender. He increased his workload, extended meetings, signed new ventures, and convinced himself that distraction was devotion. The child would arrive, and he would remain the same. That was the plan, the contract, the safety. Yet something in his chest already knew that nothing about this arrangement would follow the logic of signatures. Clara's body, once predictable and obedient, became a universe she didn't recognize. The nausea arrived before dawn, rolling like a tide that wouldn't recede, and by the time she found her balance, the factory bell was already ringing. She worked slower, her hands trembling over the conveyor line, earning glances from her supervisor that said, everything words couldn't. The clinic told her to rest, but rest was a luxury people like her couldn't afford. Her mother's condition worsened, her medication more expensive each week, and though the first installments from the contract kept them afloat, the guilt of spending that money made Clara's heart ache. It didn't feel like hers. It felt borrowed, like everything else in her life. When she went to the clinic for her third checkup, the doctor smiled too tightly. "Everything looks normal," he said, but his eyes flicked toward the monitor, lingering a moment too long. Later that night, Clara dreamt of her mother standing by the window, whispering to her belly words she couldn't understand. When she woke, the dream clung to her skin like mist. She placed a hand over her stomach and whispered back, as if the child inside could hear, "Whatever you are, be kind." The city outside rumbled with indifference, but inside that small room, the air trembled with something that felt alive and ancient. By the 4th month, the reports began to confuse the doctors. The embryo's growth patterns deviated subtly, not alarmingly, but enough to defy the expected curve. They ran extra tests, whispered in hallways, spoke of rare hormonal phenomena. Nathaniel demanded full disclosure, sitting through presentations filled with graphs and medical jargon, his patience thinning with every vague answer. "So it's safe?" he pressed. The head of genetics hesitated. "Safe, yes. Ordinary, no." It was an answer that pleased no one. After that meeting, Nathaniel drove himself to the clinic, something he hadn't done in years. He didn't tell his assistant, didn't alert the board, didn't bring his usual armor of distance. When he arrived, the nurse blinked, startled by the sight of him. The man who could buy continents standing in a waiting room that smelled of disinfectant and hope. Clara was there, sitting in a corner reading a pamphlet on prenatal nutrition. When she looked up, he almost turned away. "You came," she said simply, and her smile was so disarming that he forgot why he'd come at all. The nurse called her name and she stood. He followed, not because he was invited, but because something in him refused to let her walk behind that door alone. Inside the ultrasound room, the air was thick with antiseptic and unspoken rules. The technician, flustered by his presence, adjusted the machine twice before finding her rhythm. The screen flickered, resolving into a faint, pulsing shape. A rhythm, steady and luminous. Nathaniel had seen heartbeats before, in hospital monitors, in dying patients, but never like this. This was not fragility. It was command. The room fell silent except for the faint whoosh of life magnified through the speakers. Clara stared at the screen, her eyes wide, her breath shallow. "That's him," she whispered. The word startled him. Him, not it. The technician smiled nervously, trying to maintain professionalism, but Nathaniel barely heard. Something inside him loosened, an old knot coming undone. When the image faded, the doctor cleared his throat. "There's an anomaly," he said softly. Both looked at him. "The cardiac rhythm is unusually strong for the gestational stage. Not dangerous, just uncommon." Nathaniel frowned. "Uncommon how?" The doctor hesitated. "It's as if the fetus is developing ahead of schedule, as if his system remembers something." The phrase made no sense, yet it stayed in his mind long after he left. That night, he dreamed of a piano melody his wife used to play, echoing in an empty nursery they never built. When he woke, his heart raced to the same rhythm he had heard on the screen. Rumors began within the clinic before they ever reached the press. Doctors gossiped in coded language. Staff exchanged looks when Nathaniel's name appeared on schedules. For the first time, his privacy felt porous, his empire's walls too thin. He received anonymous emails from tabloids fishing for scandal, but he ignored them. He had bigger battles. His board was restless, whispering that emotional involvement might compromise the company's next merger. "You can't mix sentiment with science," one of them warned. Nathaniel almost laughed at that, as if the world had ever been made of anything else. He withdrew from most operations, delegating responsibilities to subordinates who mistook his silence for strategic distance. Only his lawyer knew the truth. The man who once commanded markets now spent hours waiting outside a maternity ward, pretending to review files while listening for Clara's voice. She never noticed him there, or maybe she did and chose not to speak. They existed in that fragile balance between strangers and something far more dangerous. Two people who had begun to need each other without permission. Clara's dreams grew stranger. She began to feel sensations that weren't hers. Flashes of places she had never seen, scents that didn't belong to her world. Salt air, piano notes, burning candles. During her next exam, the doctor mentioned a neurological phenomenon, maternal mirroring, where a surrogate might develop psychological projections from the donor DNA. "It's harmless," he said. But Clara wasn't convinced. She didn't tell him that sometimes, when she closed her eyes, she could feel someone else's grief. A man's grief, heavy and cold, like a room without air. She didn't know that at those same hours, Nathaniel often woke with his chest tight, as if someone had just whispered his name. The invisible cord between them tightened, and both resisted acknowledging it. He told himself it was empathy, nothing more. She told herself it was fear, nothing less. But neither could explain why every night felt like they were dreaming the same dream. Two lives separated by class, stitched together by something that moved beneath reason. The day the doctor called, Nathaniel was in a meeting that should have defined the next decade of his empire. But the word urgent pierced through every layer of corporate ritual. He left without apology. When he arrived at the clinic, Clara was sitting in the examination room, pale and quiet. The doctor looked between them, unsure who to address. "There's been an irregularity," he said finally. "The genetic markers, they're not aligning perfectly with the donor sequence." Nathaniel's throat dried. "Meaning?" "Meaning," the doctor continued, "this baby's DNA doesn't entirely match either the donor's or Miss Morales's. It's unprecedented." Silence fell like a curtain. Clara pressed a hand over her belly, instinctively protective. Nathaniel stood frozen, the world narrowing to the soft sound of the monitor. For a moment he thought he heard two heartbeats, one fast, one slower, overlapping like an echo. The doctor spoke again, but Nathaniel barely heard. He knew deep down that whatever science had planned, something older had intervened. And though the contract had promised control, he understood then, with a clarity that chilled him. Control had never belonged to him at all. The news leaked on a Tuesday, the kind of day that should have meant nothing. One photograph, Nathaniel leaving the clinic, his hand brushing Clara's arm as she stepped into a cab, was enough to ignite headlines across every screen. Infertile billionaire's secret surrogate. Moral scandal or medical miracle? The words pulsed like wounds across the digital city. Within hours, his publicist was calling. His board was threatening, and the clinic was issuing statements wrapped in legal caution. Nathaniel sat in his office, unmoving, watching the photos circulate like a storm he could neither stop nor predict. The image was innocent, almost tender, yet the world twisted it into theater. Investors questioned his judgment. The board suggested a temporary retreat from leadership. Even the charities he funded began to distance themselves politely. The empire that once obeyed him now whispered about him. He should have been angry. Instead, he felt something quieter and more dangerous, a strange sense of freedom. For years, his life had been sculpted by control, each decision a fortress against chaos. Now chaos had come, and it looked nothing like he expected. It had the eyes of a woman who refused to break under shame. For Clara, the scandal arrived like thunder breaking through a prayer. Reporters camped outside her building, their cameras waiting for glimpses of scandal that didn't exist. Neighbors avoided her in the hallways, pretending she was contagious. Even the factory called to say her position had been temporarily reassigned. She spent days behind drawn curtains, holding her mother's trembling hands, whispering that it would pass. It didn't. The clinic offered relocation to a safe address, a small house on the city's edge where no one knew her name. She accepted, packing her life into 2 suitcases and leaving behind everything except the faint smell of her mother's lavender soap. Nathaniel arranged the logistics silently through his assistant. He told himself it was duty, not guilt. But when he saw her step into the car, wearing the same worn coat she'd had on the day they met, he felt a sting that no amount of money could dull. That night he canceled every meeting. He didn't sleep. He opened his wife's old piano, untouched since her death, and pressed one key. The note hung in the air, a single tone of grief and defiance. Somewhere across the city, Clara lay awake, listening to the wind through thin curtains, and for a fleeting second, she thought she heard music. The following weeks blurred into a strange truce with isolation. Nathaniel retreated from the press, his appearances reduced to statements through intermediaries. His face vanished from magazines, replaced by speculation and rumor. He no longer cared. Each morning he found himself staring at his phone, waiting for the clinic's reports. Not of the company, not of profits, but of her. Clara's health remained stable, the baby's heart strong, yet the anomaly persisted. The doctors avoided conclusions, each update ending with the same sterile reassurance. Unusual, but not concerning. The phrase became his new obsession. What did it mean for something to be unusual but not concerning? Couldn't those 2 states coexist only in denial? He began to visit again, against advice, slipping through side entrances like a man sneaking into his own sins. The staff stopped questioning it. They had grown used to his presence, the quiet figure in tailored suits, sitting in maternity waiting rooms with a gaze too focused to be casual. When Clara saw him, she didn't ask why he came. She simply said, "You shouldn't be here," and he answered, "I know." But neither of them moved. It was the kind of disobedience that felt like mercy. As the child grew, Clara's dreams deepened into visions, fragments of memories that were not her own. She would wake trembling, hearing the echo of a woman's laughter, smelling perfume she had never worn. The clinic psychiatrist explained it as hormonal empathy, an imprint of genetic material carrying residual memory. It sounded scientific enough to dismiss, but she couldn't. The dreams felt deliberate, almost guiding. One afternoon, when Nathaniel came for a routine visit, she asked him, "Did your wife play piano?" He froze. "Yes," he said slowly. "Why?" Clara hesitated, unsure whether to tell him about the melody that haunted her sleep. The same one she'd heard faintly that night in her apartment, long before they had met again. "Because," she murmured, "your child hums it." Nathaniel felt the world tilt slightly, as if gravity had shifted its allegiance. He wanted to deny it, to laugh, to accuse her of imagination. But the air between them was too heavy for disbelief. For the first time he saw her not as an employee, not as an arrangement, but as the living bridge between past and future, carrying something that refused to obey logic. He left without speaking further, but when he entered his empty home, the piano lid was open. One key vibrated softly, though no one had touched it. The board's patience finally snapped. They summoned him to an emergency meeting, the longest table in the building, now an arena of polite hostility. They spoke of reputational damage, fiduciary duty, succession planning. He listened, detached, as if watching a play he no longer remembered auditioning for. When they suggested a temporary leave of absence, he signed the papers without resistance. It startled them. They expected the old Nathaniel, sharp, defensive, a man allergic to losing ground. Instead, he looked almost relieved. "Take whatever you need," he said. "Just leave me the quiet." They didn't understand that in surrendering control of his empire, he was reclaiming something else. He drove straight to the clinic, no longer in a suit, but in a gray sweater that made him look human again. When Clara saw him arrive, unannounced and unguarded, she understood what he had lost. "They took it from you," she said softly. "No," he replied, "I gave it away." And though neither admitted it, both felt the strange intimacy of two people stripped of everything but truth. They began to talk, not as employer and surrogate, but as two souls orbiting the same wound. Sometimes he told her stories of his wife, Elise, how she loved storms, how she once planted an olive tree in their garden because she believed roots could teach patience. Clara listened, her hand resting on her belly, feeling the faint kicks that seemed to respond to his voice. She told him of her mother, of the poverty that shaped her like a constant horizon, of the fear of being seen as a body for hire rather than a person. They shared silences longer than their words, and in those pauses, something fragile began to bloom. Not love exactly, but recognition. That secret form of kinship born when two people admit they're both unfinished. Yet even tenderness had its shadow. The clinic staff noticed their closeness, whispered about boundaries, advised separation. The doctor warned, emotional entanglement can complicate detachment later. Nathaniel smiled faintly at the word detachment. For once he wasn't afraid of complication. But the outside world wasn't finished with them. One evening, a journalist managed to breach the clinic's privacy barriers, armed with forged credentials and a camera. Clara was in the hallway when she saw the flash, the sudden glare of intrusion. Her instinct was to shield her face, but Nathaniel stepped forward, placing himself between her and the lens. Security intervened too late. The image, his arm protectively around her, spread like wildfire by dawn. The world saw romance where there was refuge, sin where there was salvation. Religious groups condemned the immorality. Shareholders demanded explanations, and strangers online debated her worth as if morality were a commodity. The pressure nearly broke her. "Maybe I should end this," she whispered one night at the clinic. Meaning the contract, the pregnancy, the ordeal. Nathaniel's response was quiet but unwavering. "No, you're not alone in this anymore." And for the first time, she believed him. Then came the confession that rewrote everything. It happened on a rain-soaked night when the clinic lights flickered and the power dipped. They were alone in the observation room, the generator humming like a restless heartbeat. Nathaniel stared at the ultrasound image, the small, shifting figure suspended in a glowing sea, and said, "That's not my child." Clara turned sharply, confusion in her eyes. "What do you mean?" He exhaled, trembling. "I checked the donor records. The embryo, the cell line they used. It belonged to my wife. She'd stored genetic material before she died. I thought it was destroyed." Clara's hand rose to her mouth. "Then this—" "Yes," he interrupted, voice breaking. "This child carries her, not me." The room fell silent, except for the steady pulse from the monitor. For a long moment neither spoke. Then Clara whispered, "Maybe that's how love returns, through someone else's body." Nathaniel closed his eyes, overwhelmed by a grief that suddenly felt holy. The storm outside battered the windows, but inside, something like peace began to form. Fragile, trembling, unstoppable. The following days unfolded like the aftermath of an earthquake. Quiet at first, then trembling with delayed ruin. Nathaniel avoided the clinic, terrified of what his own presence might now represent. Every detail of the revelation replayed in his mind. His wife's preserved genetic material, the failed destruction order, the way fate had twisted legality into miracle. The woman he'd loved, the one whose ashes he had scattered across the Mediterranean, had returned not as a memory, but as a heartbeat in another woman's body. He wanted to feel gratitude, awe even, but what he felt was something far darker: guilt. He had chosen surrogacy to master nature, to create on his own terms, and yet life had found its way back through the smallest crack in his arrogance. In his empty house, dust glimmered through the window light, settling on the old piano. The melody that used to belong to Elise echoed faintly in his head. He sat, touched one key, then another, until the notes stitched into the same lullaby that Clara claimed to hear. He stopped suddenly, tears burning. What if the child recognized that song before it was even born? What if Elise had never truly left? And this entire arrangement, had been her quiet rebellion from beyond the veil. Clara, meanwhile, wrestled with a fear she couldn't name. She had known from the start that she was carrying another person's dream, but now she wondered if that dream had become sentient. The baby moved differently these days, not with the restless spasms of a growing fetus, but with a rhythm, a strange deliberation that sometimes synchronized with her breathing. The doctors dismissed it as maternal illusion, a common psychosomatic trick. Yet each night she felt something that contradicted science, a sensation of recognition. As if the child knew her thoughts, responded to her sadness. She started talking aloud, half to herself, half to the life inside. "Who are you really?" she'd whisper in the dark. "And why do I feel like you already know me?" Her mother's health had declined sharply, and each hospital visit drained her savings. She had once seen the surrogacy as salvation. Now it felt like penance. Her faith, small but stubborn, whispered that God sometimes lent souls for a purpose. Perhaps this child was meant to heal more than one family. But healings, she knew, never came without pain. When she closed her eyes, she imagined Nathaniel sitting somewhere, surrounded by silence too big for one man to bear, and felt an ache she couldn't explain. When he finally returned to the clinic, days had blurred into sleepless nights. He looked different. The precision of his clothes replaced by weariness, his face stripped of its corporate mask. Clara was sitting near the window when he entered. She stood slowly, uncertain whether to speak. "You shouldn't be here," she said again. The same words as before, but softer now, as if afraid that asking him to leave would also dismiss something sacred. "I needed to see," he replied. "To see that it's real." She frowned. "You think it isn't?" He hesitated, searching for words. "I don't know what to think anymore. My wife, she wanted a child more than anything. She stored her cells before the cancer treatments, hoping we'd use them one day. I never did. I thought letting her go meant destroying everything connected to her." Clara placed a trembling hand on her belly. "Then maybe she found another way." He looked at her, and for the first time neither of them felt like the owner or the hired. They were simply witnesses to something far beyond them both. The moment stretched, filled with the hum of the machines, the steady sound of life continuing despite confusion. But peace, as always, was temporary. Word of the genetic irregularities reached the media through a leaked document, and the narrative turned savage. "Illicit experiment," one headline read. "Dead wife's DNA used without consent." Nathaniel's company stock plummeted overnight. Protesters appeared outside the clinic, demanding justice for a woman who could no longer speak for herself. Religious leaders called it desecration. Rival investors called it proof of madness. He could have denied everything, yet he didn't. He stood before cameras once, saying only, "No law defines what the heart remembers." It wasn't an explanation. It was surrender. His lawyer begged him to stay silent afterward. Clara, confined to her safe house, watched the broadcasts with her hands over her stomach, whispering prayers for protection. She wasn't sure if she meant protection from the world or from destiny itself. The noise outside grew unbearable, but the quiet within her body remained unshaken, steady as the tide. She could feel the baby kicking stronger now, as if reminding her that the miracle was not in the headlines, but in the beating rhythm under her ribs. Then, one evening, the inevitable confrontation arrived. Nathaniel appeared at her door, drenched from rain, eyes hollow with exhaustion. She let him in without a word. The small living room smelled of chamomile and fear. "You're everywhere," she said, voice trembling. "Every channel, every paper. They're calling it a crime." He laughed bitterly. "Maybe it is. Maybe I've stolen something that was never meant to be reborn." "Then why are you here?" she asked quietly. He looked at her, and for once the mask broke completely. "Because she's back," he whispered. "Every night I hear her. Every dream smells like her perfume. And I think, no, I know, that this isn't about ownership or legacy anymore. It's about forgiveness." Clara stepped closer, studying him as if trying to see through the layers of guilt and grief. "Forgiveness for what?" "For playing God," he said. The silence that followed felt like absolution. Rain drummed against the windows, the only witness to two broken people standing on the edge of something both holy and impossible. But miracles often demand a price. Days later, Clara collapsed during a routine exam. Her blood pressure spiked, her body trembling with symptoms the doctors couldn't name. The pregnancy had entered a dangerous phase. Early delivery was now a looming threat. Nathaniel refused to leave her bedside. The hospital's sterile corridors felt like a judgment hall, every machine a reminder of human limits. The doctors argued over interventions. He listened to none. "Save her first," he said, voice sharp but trembling. "Do whatever you must, but save her." They warned him that both lives were at risk, that no decision guaranteed safety. Still he stayed. He held her hand through the contractions, whispered words he didn't know he remembered. Old prayers Elise used to murmur when the pain grew too much. Clara, half-conscious, whispered back, "Don't let her take me yet." He didn't know who her meant, Elise, death, fate, but he repeated the words like a vow. Hours stretched into eternity, and by dawn, the monitors steadied. She survived. The child remained, stubbornly alive, but Nathaniel's certainty shattered for good. He realized then that control was not the opposite of chaos. It was its disguise. When Clara awoke, the world outside had changed. The clinic was under investigation, Nathaniel's accounts frozen, and every channel replayed the footage of his desperate vigil beside her hospital bed. He had become a symbol, not of scandal anymore, but of something no one could categorize. Some called him a sinner seeking redemption, others a man finally human. She watched him sleep in the chair beside her, unshaven, exhausted, his hand still loosely holding hers, and felt something shift inside her that had nothing to do with biology. Compassion blurred into something deeper, something terrifying. When he stirred awake, their eyes met, and for a brief moment, all accusations, all contracts, all names disappeared. There was only the pulse of two lives connected by a story that refused to obey logic. "You could still walk away," she said softly. "You owe me nothing now." He smiled weakly. "Maybe not, but I think you're carrying more than my child." Her lips trembled. "Then what am I carrying?" He hesitated. "A second chance." The child's next ultrasound was unlike any before. The technicians exchanged glances, uncertain whether to speak. The heartbeat was strong, impossibly strong, echoing through the speakers like thunder wrapped in song. Nathaniel watched the screen, the image of the small figure floating in shadow, and felt his throat tighten. It wasn't fear this time. It was awe, the kind that humbles rather than conquers. Clara's hand found his, their fingers locking in silent understanding. The doctor murmured something about unexplainable vitality, about memory encoded in cell structures, but the words dissolved into static. For them, there was no need for explanation. In that dark room, lit only by the pulse of life projected onto a screen, they both understood that what had begun as a transaction had become something eternal. The child, born of grief, greed, and hope, was now rewriting every law they had ever trusted. And though the world outside still screamed for answers, Nathaniel finally stopped searching for them. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe in something he could neither buy nor prove. The miracle had already begun. The hospital became their new world, not the gleaming, sterile one of wealth and privilege that Nathaniel once knew, but a quieter universe built from routine and whispered prayers. Machines beeped softly, nurses passed like ghosts, and time seemed to dissolve between dawns that looked identical. Nathaniel refused to leave Clara's side, ignoring the doctor's polite insistence that rest would do him good. Sleep had abandoned him long ago. He sat through each shift of nurses, learning the strange rhythm of her breathing, the way her fingers twitched when she dreamed, the way the monitor pulsed faster whenever he spoke. At first, he thought it was coincidence. Later, he stopped trying to explain it. The walls of logic had already fallen. Once a man who measured his life in contracts, he now measured it in heartbeats, hers and the child's. He ate whatever she ate, drank when she did, moved only when necessary. When the doctors noticed, one murmured that emotional transference was common in complex surrogate cases. But Nathaniel knew it wasn't that. It was something older, an invisible thread binding three souls who had no right to share the same fate. Each morning he whispered the same words near her bed, almost ritualistic. "One day at a time, Clara. One more day." The outside world raged on without mercy. Investigations, debates, opinion columns, all dissecting what had happened between science, morality, and love. Some said it was divine interference. Others said it was corruption disguised as faith. The company Nathaniel once ruled fractured under interim management. His name erased from letterheads. His voice silenced from decisions. He didn't fight it. For the first time in his adult life, he had no interest in the numbers that once defined him. His lawyer called daily, pleading for statements, damage control, public rehabilitation. Nathaniel ignored every call. He wasn't trying to restore his image. He was trying to understand his soul. He spent hours staring at Clara's ultrasound photos, not as evidence, but as confession. The silent proof of a life that refused to conform to categories. Some nights he wandered the hospital corridors barefoot, passing rooms filled with strangers suffering. He'd stop sometimes to help adjust a patient's blanket or pick up a dropped item, unnoticed by nurses. Acts that once seemed insignificant became the only things that felt real. In losing everything, he discovered presence, a language beyond transaction, something Elise had once tried to teach him when she said, "Love isn't what we build, Nate, it's what survives us." Clara's recovery was slow, marked by fragile progress and sudden pain. Each contraction of her body seemed to echo the contractions of her conscience. She wanted to hate him, for bringing her into this, for dragging her name through scandal. But every time she tried, she remembered his face beside her hospital bed. The fear that looked nothing like pride. In her mind, she replayed every stage of this strange journey. The factory where she'd first dreamed of freedom. The clinic lights. The nights she'd talked to the child when no one was listening. Somewhere between duty and affection, her heart had begun to rewrite its loyalties. She no longer saw Nathaniel as the distant man of privilege. He was simply a man. One who had lost too much. One who had loved wrongly, but not without sincerity. Sometimes, when the painkillers wore off and reality blurred, she'd ask him questions about Elise. He'd answer quietly, with the reverence of a prayer. "She loved magnolias," he'd say. "She said they smelled like forgiveness." Clara smiled once and said, "Maybe she sent me to remind you how forgiveness smells." He didn't answer, but he didn't look away either. The nights grew longer, the air colder. Nathaniel began sleeping on the small couch near the window, his body folded awkwardly in a suit that had lost its purpose. He dreamed less of Elise and more of the child, not yet born, yet somehow omnipresent. In those dreams he'd hear laughter, light but distant, and a small voice calling his name in tones he didn't recognize. Sometimes it was Clara's voice, sometimes Elise's, sometimes both. When he woke, he'd find the room silent, except for the faint hum of machines. He'd glance at Clara, her face pale but peaceful, and whisper the words he'd never managed to say to his wife before she died. "I'm not afraid anymore." He meant it. Fear had lost its use. His wealth, his reputation, his titles. All of them had been scaffolds against that fear. Now that they were gone, he felt something almost childlike in its place. A strange calmness, as if life itself had forgiven him for trying to control it. Each sunrise over the city looked softer now, as if filtered through mercy. Then came the day the doctor announced they'd reached viability. The child could survive if born now. Relief swept through the ward like wind through open windows. Nathaniel exhaled for the first time in weeks. But relief was quickly followed by decision. The doctor recommended an early cesarean to prevent further complications. Clara refused. "Not yet," she said firmly. "He's not ready." Nathaniel tried to reason with her, to remind her of the risk. "You've already done enough, Clara. You don't have to prove anything." She turned her head toward him, eyes glistening. "This isn't about proving. It's about trusting. He'll come when he chooses." The defiance in her tone reminded him of Elise. That same quiet certainty. That refusal to let fear decide the outcome. He didn't argue again. Instead, he sat beside her, holding her hand through every test, every ache, every uncertain night. He had once believed leadership was measured by command. Now he understood it was measured by patience. The waiting became their shared act of faith. Two lives suspended in a fragile covenant of hope. In the solitude of those final weeks, they began to talk about what would happen after. Clara spoke of disappearing after birth, starting over somewhere no one knew her name. Nathaniel didn't object. He respected the instinct to vanish, yet part of him recoiled from the thought. "You deserve more than a quiet exit," he said once, his voice barely audible. She smiled. "Quiet isn't a punishment. It's peace." He envied her for that. He had chased peace all his life and mistaken it for noise. As her due date approached, they began sharing small rituals: morning tea, silent prayers, moments of reading aloud from whatever book the nurses left behind. One evening she asked him to play something on the hospital's old piano in the chapel. He hesitated but agreed. The sound was off-key, the instrument weary, yet the melody filled the corridor like forgiveness made audible. When he finished, Clara whispered, "That's her song, isn't it?" He nodded. "It always was." The baby kicked as if in applause, and Nathaniel smiled through tears. In that moment, he realized that life had orchestrated something far more perfect than he ever could. 3 souls, 1 melody, and the quiet promise of a rebirth none of them deserved, but all of them needed. But even peace carries its tests. A week before the expected delivery, a sudden blackout hit the city. The hospital's generators faltered, alarms flickering. Nathaniel rushed through dark corridors lit only by emergency lights, his mind a blur of panic and prayer. When he reached Clara's room, nurses were already stabilizing her. Blood pressure spiking again, contractions starting prematurely. "We're losing time," the doctor shouted. "We need to move now." Nathaniel followed as they wheeled her into the operating room, his heart pounding in sync with the fading monitors. Outside, rain battered the windows like a warning. He stood in the hallway, hands clasped, muttering Elise's name, Clara's name, God's name, anyone's name that might be listening. Minutes felt like centuries. Then, through the chaos, he heard it. A cry, sharp and defiant. The nurse appeared, smiling through exhaustion. "She's alive," she said. "A girl." Nathaniel's knees gave way. He didn't realize he was crying until he tasted salt. When he entered the room, the world seemed to hold its breath. Clara lay pale but conscious, the baby swaddled on her chest. "A girl," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Your daughter." Nathaniel approached slowly, as if afraid to disturb the fragile miracle. The child's skin glowed faintly pink under the soft light, her tiny fingers curling around Clara's thumb. He hesitated before touching her, as if the act required permission. Clara nodded once. When his hand met the baby's, warmth surged through him. Not mystical, not divine, but profoundly human. For the first time since Elise's death, he felt alive in the present, not haunted by the past. The baby stirred, her eyes opening briefly, gray, storm-colored, the same as Elise's. "Her name," Clara murmured, "should be Grace." Nathaniel nodded. "Grace," he repeated softly. The word felt heavier than any fortune he'd ever held. The days that followed were a blur of healing and quiet wonder. The press eventually found out, of course. They always did. But the noise couldn't reach him anymore. He stayed in that hospital room like a monk guarding a sacred relic. He fed the baby, changed her, learned her rhythms, learned silence anew. Clara recovered slowly, her body fragile but her spirit steady. They talked often, about endings and beginnings, about forgiveness and fate. She told him she would leave when she could walk again, and he accepted it, though the thought cut deep. When she finally rose from the bed, he didn't try to stop her. He only said, "Wherever you go, she'll know your voice." Clara smiled faintly. "And she'll know yours." She kissed Grace's forehead, whispered something inaudible, and left the room without looking back. Nathaniel stood there holding the child, the echo of her footsteps fading. Outside, the city stirred under dawn, unaware that inside one hospital window, a man who once owned the world was learning what it truly meant to lose it, and what it meant to be found. For weeks after Clara's departure, Nathaniel lived suspended in a kind of waking dream. The hospital discharged him with the child, a small bundle of silence and need. And for the first time he returned to his penthouse without the sound of heels, voices, or glass doors. The space felt cavernous, almost indecently large for a man and a baby. He stood at the entrance, unsure where to begin. Everything he'd built, the empire, the fortune, the endless horizon of control, now looked absurd in the face of this breathing, blinking creature who depended on him for everything. Grace slept most of the day, her chest rising and falling with a rhythm that seemed to command the world to slow down. He fed her clumsily, learned to hold her without fear, to burp her against his shoulder, to read the tiny movements of her mouth as if decoding sacred script. He hadn't realized how much a human being could fit into the span of a single heartbeat until he felt hers against his chest. Sometimes, when the nights stretched long, he'd walk the penthouse halls barefoot, humming Elise's lullaby, and the sound would settle Grace instantly. He wondered if the music reached somewhere beyond sound, if Elise could hear it too, smiling at the strange symmetry of it all. But even miracles invite intrusion. The press never forgot, nor forgave his silence. Cameras found him again, this time not at a board meeting or gala, but walking the streets with a stroller, unshaven, his suit replaced by soft cotton and weariness. They called it the billionaire's redemption arc, printed photos of him buying diapers, holding the baby against his chest. The world loves a spectacle more than truth. Yet in the quiet between flashbulbs, Nathaniel found a strange calm. He no longer needed to defend anything. The narrative could twist, people could mock, analysts could speculate. None of it touched him. He had been stripped of every identity that wasn't human. What remained was raw, unmarketable, but true. In those days, he began visiting a small neighborhood church near the hospital, the kind Elise had once attended in her youth. He would sit in the back pew, the baby asleep in his arms, and watch the candles flicker. He never prayed aloud. He didn't need to. The act of holding life, fragile, undeserved life, was its own form of worship. Then one morning, as he sat by the window with Grace cradled against him, a knock came at the door. He opened it to find Clara standing there, thinner, paler, but with eyes that glowed like forgiveness itself. For a moment they simply looked at each other, the city's light glinting off the tears neither had planned to shed. "I thought you'd be gone for good," he whispered. "I tried," she said, "but I couldn't forget her cry." She stepped inside, and the silence that followed was almost holy. Grace stirred, recognizing her instantly. The baby's hands reached toward Clara as if memory were not stored in years but in heartbeat patterns. Clara took her gently, pressing her lips to the child's forehead. "You named her Grace," she said softly. "That's right," Nathaniel replied. It seemed the only word left that made sense. They spoke for hours, about everything and nothing, about how time had softened the anger, how life had rewritten every rule. By evening she was sitting on the floor, the baby asleep in her lap, and Nathaniel realized that home no longer meant walls or wealth. It meant this: two souls stitched together by grief, holding the evidence that love still found ways to return. The days that followed felt like borrowed sunlight. Clara stayed for a while, helping with Grace, showing him how to feed her properly, how to recognize the difference between hunger and comfort, between a cry of pain and a cry of longing. The apartment changed subtly. Curtains opened, the piano lid lifted, plants placed near the windows. Nathaniel laughed for the first time in years, a sound so unfamiliar it startled him. They fell into an unspoken rhythm, co-parenting without naming it, living in a peace that neither dared to question. Some nights, Clara would tell stories from her childhood, memories that sounded more like parables, about faith stitched into hunger, about how her mother used to say that every act of love echoes somewhere beyond time. Nathaniel listened as if learning a new religion. He told her once quietly, "I think Elise would have liked you." Clara smiled, brushing Grace's hair. "Maybe she already does." It wasn't sentiment, it was conviction. In that moment, both understood something profound, that the dead do not always stay gone, not when love insists on remembering them. Yet as Grace grew stronger, the question of future began to loom. The world outside had quieted, but their arrangement existed in a fragile truce with reality. "She's your daughter," Clara said one afternoon, breaking the silence neither wanted to address. "You have the means to raise her safely. I was never meant to stay." Nathaniel's hands tightened around his cup. "She's our child," he said. "Without you, there would be no her." Clara looked away. "That's not how the world sees it," he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Then let the world be wrong." But she shook her head, gentle and resolute. "You need to rebuild your life. I need to find mine." There was no anger, only acceptance. Two travelers at a crossroads, both knowing that love sometimes means release. They decided she would leave after Grace's first birthday. Until then, they lived deliberately, each day a small eternity, each night a quiet rehearsal for goodbye. Grace's first birthday came with no guests, no photographers, no luxury. Just a small cake Clara baked in Nathaniel's kitchen and a single candle flickering between them. The baby clapped her hands at the flame, eyes wide with delight. Nathaniel lifted her, kissed her forehead, whispered a prayer he didn't know he remembered. Clara watched them, her expression a mixture of joy and grief. "You did it," she said. "You gave her the world." He looked at her, realizing the truth, that she had given him one instead. When it was time for her to go, they didn't make promises. Promises belong to certainty, and theirs was built from faith. She packed lightly, the same worn suitcase she'd brought to the clinic months ago. At the door, she turned once more to look at them. "Take care of her," she said. "Take care of yourself," he answered. And then she was gone. Months passed, and the city moved on, as cities do. Nathaniel began a foundation in Elise's and Clara's names, a quiet institution dedicated to maternal care and ethical surrogacy, offering help to women who had none. He spent his days not in boardrooms but in hospitals and classrooms, listening to stories, funding lives. Grace grew, her laughter filling every empty space that once echoed with silence. She had Elise's eyes, Clara's patience, and something ineffable that belonged to neither, a serenity that seemed borrowed from the world beyond. Each evening, Nathaniel played the same lullaby on the piano, the melody now softer, slower, the sound of a man at peace. When Grace was old enough to ask questions, she would climb onto his lap and point to a framed photograph on the piano. A picture of three hands, hers, Clara's, and Nathaniel's, taken in the hospital long ago. "Who's the other lady?" she'd ask. He'd smile. "The reason you're here." "Do I look like her?" "More than you know." Sometimes he'd find himself staring at that picture long after she fell asleep, wondering where Clara was, whether she'd found the quiet life she longed for. He didn't try to find her. Love, he'd learned, doesn't always mean possession. It means gratitude, carried quietly through time. And each time Grace laughed, each time she sang, he heard two voices within her, one of the woman he had lost, one of the woman who had saved him. Together, they made harmony. Years later, at sunset, Nathaniel took Grace to the garden where Elise had once planted the olive tree. It had grown tall, its leaves shimmering silver in the dying light. He lifted the child into his arms, her small hands grasping a branch, her laughter soft against his neck. "Mom used to say these trees mean peace," he told her. "It took me a long time to understand." Grace looked up, curious. "Do you think she can see us?" Nathaniel smiled faintly. "I think she never stopped." He kissed her hair, inhaling the scent of sunlight and earth, the scent of everything he'd once feared to lose. As they walked back toward the house, he looked over his shoulder one last time. The wind moved through the leaves like applause, and for the first time in his life, Nathaniel Voss, once the man who owned everything, understood that nothing in this world is truly ours to keep, only ours to love while it stays. Time, when observed closely, stops being a line. It becomes a circle, folding upon itself like breath returning to lungs. Years had passed since that storm of scandal and rebirth, and yet for Nathaniel life still felt like a whisper that refused to fade. He had aged, his hair silvered at the temples, his shoulders softer now. But the sharpness that once cut through every conversation had dissolved into something gentler. The empire he'd once ruled had long outgrown him, reshaped by younger, hungrier minds. They still sent him reports, quarterly summaries he rarely opened. The world measured success in numbers. He measured it now in silence. His days revolved around Grace, around her laughter that sounded like a language older than words, around the quiet satisfaction of doing small things well. Making breakfast, folding tiny clothes, tending to the olive tree that stood taller than the house. There were nights when he'd sit beneath its branches, looking at the stars scattered like ash, wondering if Elise watched from wherever love retreats to after death. He hoped she saw not the man who had failed her, but the one who had finally learned how to stay. Grace had grown into a child full of light and strange wisdom, the kind that seems borrowed from another lifetime. She asked questions most adults had forgotten how to form, about love, forgiveness, the meaning of belonging. "Am I yours?" she asked once at 6, her voice uncertain. Nathaniel smiled and lifted her onto his knee. "You're not mine," he said. "You're with me." She frowned, confused. "Isn't that the same?" "No," he said softly. "To belong means to be held forever. To be with someone means you choose them every day." Grace thought for a long moment, then nodded as if she understood something too vast for her years. That night, Nathaniel wrote those words down and framed them in the foundation's lobby, carved in brass. "We do not own love. We honor it by choosing." Visitors often paused there, reading it aloud, unaware that behind the phrase lay the entire architecture of one man's redemption. The foundation had grown into something larger than he'd ever imagined. It spanned cities now, building clinics where no one else had cared to build, offering women the dignity that poverty had once denied Clara. Each wall bore her name alongside Elise's, joined not by a hyphen but by a symbol, an olive branch etched in gold. When donors asked about its meaning, Nathaniel would smile faintly and say, "It stands for peace between what is lost and what is found." He traveled often to these places, walking through wards filled with newborn cries and exhausted laughter, each echo a reminder of what love looked like when stripped of transaction. The staff knew him simply as Mr. Voss, a quiet benefactor who always carried a worn photograph in his wallet, not of wealth or power, but of two women holding the same child, their hands overlapping like threads of time. He never explained it. Some things belong to silence. Every year on Grace's birthday, a small envelope arrived at the office, unsigned, postmarked from different cities. Inside there was always the same thing: a pressed magnolia flower and a short line written in delicate handwriting. She still plays the song. The first time, Nathaniel stared at it for hours, his heart pounding. He didn't need a signature. Clara's words, simple and exact, said everything. She was alive somewhere, living the quiet she'd longed for, and that was enough. He never tried to find her. He only placed each magnolia in a small glass box on the piano, one for every year of Grace's life. When the 10th flower arrived, Grace noticed and asked, "Who sends them?" He smiled. "Someone who remembers." "Do you miss her?" she asked. He paused before answering. "I miss what her courage taught me." It wasn't an answer meant to hide truth. It was the only one that didn't break the spell of peace they had all built with such fragile care. As Grace grew, music became her language. She would sit for hours at the piano, her small fingers tracing melodies she'd never been taught. The first time Nathaniel heard it, he froze. It was Elise's song, the same lullaby, played not by imitation, but instinct. The notes filled the room like memory reborn. He stood by the doorway, tears gathering in the corners of his eyes, and whispered, "She really does still play it." When Grace looked up and smiled, he saw in her everything that the world had tried to divide. Bloodlines, grief, science, love. All of it fused into one gentle truth: that life always finds a way to remember itself. He never told her where the song came from. She didn't ask. Some knowledge arrives too early for words. She only said, "It makes the air feel alive." And he nodded, because that was exactly what it did. When Nathaniel turned 60, he returned to the clinic, now transformed into a branch of his own foundation. The halls were cleaner, brighter, the walls lined with photographs of smiling families, each story a testament to compassion over commerce. He walked slowly, touching the frames, until he reached the room where it had all begun. The old observation room, still smelling faintly of antiseptic and history. The nurse recognized him, though years had passed, and handed him a folder with his name. Inside was the original contract, yellowed with age, and a note he had never seen before, written in Clara's handwriting. "You once asked who this child belonged to. The answer was never either of us. She belongs to the part of the world that still believes in miracles." Nathaniel folded the paper carefully, his vision blurring. He slipped it back into his pocket, knowing that some answers must remain close to the heart, not the mind. In his final years, the olive tree bore fruit for the first time. Grace was 12 then, standing beside him when he picked the small green gifts of the earth. "It means peace," he told her, "but not the kind that comes easy. The kind you fight for quietly." She laughed and said, "Like you did?" He smiled, "Like we did." That night they sat under the tree with oil lamps glowing softly around them, and Nathaniel told her stories. Not of money, but of love's strange persistence. He spoke of Elise, of Clara, of the music that had carried him through years of silence. "Do you think they'd like each other?" Grace asked. Nathaniel looked toward the sky, where stars trembled like memory. "They already do," he said. The wind stirred then, moving through the branches, and for a moment he could swear he heard laughter woven with song. Two voices blending, distant but near enough to make him close his eyes and listen. When Nathaniel Voss passed away, the world remembered him not as the empire builder or the scandal's subject, but as the man who taught the impossible, that love survives even the boundaries of death, blood, and reason. At his funeral, held in the garden beneath the olive tree, Grace played the same melody that had haunted generations of their story. The air shimmered with sunlight and tears. A woman stood at the edge of the crowd, unnoticed by most. Older, hair streaked with silver, a small magnolia pinned to her dress. She didn't speak, didn't cry, only smiled through the quiet. When the ceremony ended, she approached the grave, placed one final flower upon it, and whispered, "Thank you for keeping your promise." Then she turned, walking away into the brightness of afternoon. Grace, watching from afar, felt a sudden peace without knowing why. The wind moved gently through the leaves, scattering light across the ground, and somewhere between earth and sky, the melody carried on. The song that had once begun in grief, now ending in grace, circling endlessly, like love itself.